Hello, everybody. Welcome to Causal Islands Podcast, live on Discord number 3. We'll be talking about alternatives to modern programming languages. I'm Zishan Lakhani. Joining me today, on the host side of things, is CTO of Fission and programming language and distributed systems extraordinaire, Brooklyn Zelenka. Brooklyn, you want to say hello?
Hey, folks.
Usually Brooklyn would be like on the other side of this. maybe, maybe we'll have thoughts. Yeah, it's weird on this side. And we're also joined by the person who puts together all these podcasts and all these recordings, Becky, who's head of marketing at Fission. And before I introduce the speakers, we have maybe a speaker coming late today. We have one speaker on, Ramsey and Nasser. Before I introduce Ramsey, Becky, you put this one together, and you were obviously very involved with Causal Islands and really loved some of these talks. Do you want to kind of intro, a little bit about why we're doing this one and why it's so interesting?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Ramsey, for agreeing to come on this podcast. I became familiar with your work. I guess it was a few months before Causal Islands. The way I found your work was through the programming language ALP. And I thought this was so interesting that you have this programming language that is in Arabic, and because it's not in this like ASCII, like Latin-based alphabet, from its foundation, there's actually a lot of really interesting things you can do with it. And I don't want to, spoil anything that we'll be talking about today, but certain things like I just started learning Arabic myself, and I think it's really interesting how the letters connect and how you can use that when you're actually like aesthetically, like when you're coding, and how it all looks on screen as well, and how there's such a beautiful tradition of like poetry in the Arabic language, and it's like it kind of the calligraphy and the poetry kind of lend itself to the language that you've made. So all of that is to say is like I thought it was really interesting how language and culture are so intertwined, and I think we don't think about that enough when it comes to computer languages. We think about that when it comes to just us, talking, but it's also like culture is also really intertwined with like computer languages as well, for better or for worse, right? So that was what kind of inspired me to initiate this and have this discussion. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, and for your kind words. And I'm glad that work resonated with you. And best of luck on your journey learning Arabic. It's extremely grateful that I can understand that language, and it's a very gratifying cultural body to engage with. So enjoy it.
It's a long journey to learn languages. I'm pretty horrible at these, but yeah, Ramsey, do you want to give a little intro about yourself? Particularly, we can talk a little bit about Gold. I'm also totally mispronouncing that, but I think it would be great for you to give a little intro about yourself. Obviously, you have like a super varied background through a lot of things, but then kind of focus on how you kind of been focusing on working in languages that as Becky mentioned, like have been from the kind of Latin paradigm in programming, and you've been doing this for a while.
Yeah, so I have a background in computer science and art. I studied computer science at the American University of Beirut, and I got an MFA at Parsons here in New York City. And my MFA was in design and technology, so it was in sort of art and like aesthetics around computing and technology. So always in and around computers, for better or for worse, my whole life. And yeah, as you said, Zishan, my kind of all over the place in terms of my background. It all feels coherent to me. It all kind of comes from the same place. But I've been involved in video game development, programming language development, like compiler stuff, distributed systems design and development, which I'm getting into increasingly at this stage of my career. And in the last few years, I've also been involved in alternate like forms of labor organizing. So I do all my work these days through a worker cooperative that I founded with some others. It's based in New York City as a sort of a living experiment in a democratic worker managed workplace, and that's been an incredibly gratifying experience. So I feel like the same part of me that's tickled by compiler theory and reading virtual machine specifications is like similarly, I wouldn't say equally, but similarly tickled by reading the like arcane acts of Congress with respect to the American tax code. It's basically the worst spec for the stupidest virtual machine ever made is how the tax system feels like here. But that's where a lot of my energy has gone the last year or two. But that's my background. When it relates to the unconventional or non-Latin programming, I guess that really stems from my time at Parsons when I'd started teaching then, and I was teaching processing mainly to people who did not have a programming background.
Hell yeah, it's processing for sure though. As a great learning language, that's how I learned. So anyway, yeah, absolutely no. It's one of those things. I feel like there are projects that are interesting or achieve certain goals, but then there are projects that I really think represent a contribution to computing as a project, and processing is one of those. I think it's a sort of a before after moment for computing and the approachability of programming to people who don't have a computer science background, and it's really a phenomenal, and with its own very interesting history. Coming from design by numbers at MIT, and but so I'm teaching processing to non-programmers at Parsons as a second year, teaching basically the incoming first years programming, and also Open Frameworks is there, and Unity was also a very different beast at the time, but Unity was also this really interesting way to get into making video games for people who didn't have that background. So there's all this sort of language or rhetoric in the air about democratizing computing, that's a word that gets thrown around I think more than it should. But and you would say those were domains that were being democratized, right? In particular, right? Like gaming and stuff and yeah, right.
Visual, artistic aesthetic programming, and the idea was we have built these tools that have made programming easier for everyone, and everyone is in gigantic quotes, and to an extent that's fair. The tools had to sort of expanded access to more people, but I studied computer science in Beirut. I grew up in Beirut, and I learned Arabic before I learned English. It's my native language. And it's immediately obvious to me that, this is all English. all these programming languages they're so obviously based on English. When you say everyone, you can't possibly mean all humans, because not everyone speaks English. Most people, don't speak English actually. So that's, I think, the jumping off point is the sort of question of who is everyone when we talk about bringing programming to everyone. What are the things that make programming look the way that it does? And privilege a certain group of people over others, and how can we sort of confront that and challenge it?
Yeah, that's obviously a great kind of leading off point to this. And one question that I had before open it up maybe to even some other questions was, I think when I was going back to one of your videos, and I'll try to link this in the notes, but I think one of the opening videos when you were showcasing the language, and it was like an opening where you had 3 algorithms implemented in the language. You had Conway's Game of Life, you had Fibonacci, right? I forget what the third one was. But it was I think when you first demoed this or first, I guess, exhibited is the word I want to use here. This work with Gold, it was like in an art. It was like toward an art, toward an art experience, an art exhibition. And so, how do you? And obviously, I've known your work. You've done a lot of work. Obviously, you did some live music stuff at Causal Islands and elsewhere with Fennel, and a lot of cool other interesting kind of languages that play on the esoteric spectrum. But how do you see where like art in particular, art tech, and has really kind of opened up avenues to showcase this kind of work that might not have been like made it through easily in more academic or industrial context?
No, that's a great question. So Elb was it's sometimes mistakenly, I think people will refer to it as a master's work. It was not my master's work. After my MFA, I was fortunate enough to be awarded a fellowship at the IBEAM Art and Technology Center, which is an incredible New York City institution where many of my
shout out to IBEAM,
my own like media art heroes passed through there, and so they supported me for a year. Well, I was actually building a variety of things. I had not applied with this in mind. But halfway through my fellowship, it became clear that like this is actually what I wanted to pursue and hack on. So Elb was built in 2013 at IBEAM and was first shown at the IBEAM End of Year Artist Showcase it was built in 2012 and was shown in 2013. To your point about the pronunciation, it's sort of deliberately ambiguous. The correct classical Arabic translation is qalb with a hard K. In the Levant, where I'm from, it's a glottal stop, so we'd say Elb. Gulb is how you'd say it in the Gulf, so that's also a valid pronunciation. But yeah, when it first came out, the like Hacker News thread about how to correctly even say this thing out loud was like very delicious for me to watch. People sort of arguing with each other about like whether the first letter is like sort of like every Arab culture basically says it a little differently, which is part of why I chose it.
It's not just language; it's the dialect too, right? I mean, obviously, that's another sub. It's like sub logic. It's a structural logic to the same language, right?
Yeah, I mean, to Becky's point about the relationship between language and culture, I think Arabic does and I'll get to your question about the art context in a second, but I think Arabic does a really great job of confounding that because, like one subtle kind of Western assumption is that languages and cultures are much more closely intertwined. So in English, there are months and the months have names. There's only one set of names for the months. That's absolutely not true in Arabic. Different Arab cultures, different Arabic-speaking people will have different names for the months. Because Arabic, covers a gigantic territory from Morocco to Kuwait at the very least, North Africa and the Middle East. And they're just different people with different backgrounds that have different names for things, right? So yeah, we have different names for months. So every localization system that has like a sort of a pairing between a language and a set of month names kind of falls apart for Arabic. So there's like all of these like, subtle cultural assumptions that are baked into, I think, computing that really stem from a particular Western culture. And the art context, honestly, was and I think remains the best way to ask those questions. Because it's like, Elb is not really an engineering project. I mean, I did build an interpreter, and like it was important that it be a real thing and not just like a speculative project. Because I wanted the tool itself to sort of tell me what it needed to be, and I wanted the constraints to be real and not imagined. But it's also like, from a software engineering perspective, it's absurd. Like, you would never do this. There's no real reason to do it. And we can talk later about why I think a project like Elb is sort of doomed by definition and can't ever really achieve super wide scale. But there had been other Arabic programming languages before Elb. It also mistakenly gets described as the first Arabic programming language. That's not even close to true. I've never sort of credit that. But there have been other languages that basically took the problem seriously. Like, okay, let's build a real production-grade compiler and interpreter and development environment for Arabic and see how far we can get with it. And people tried, but But I think the art context is one within which I can sort of ask the question of like, why is this impossible? And what are the bigger sort of pressures that make a certain kind of tool feasible and other tools infeasible? So there's just a wider scope to art and an art practice, I think, than you have in engineering or other practices.
Yeah, that's a great. I mean, it's a great reasoning too. I mean, to your point, like to have to build the entire thing, it would, I mean, when Jon gets on, we'll talk about like long-term, lifelong projects in many ways, right? But it would, building, to your point, building it from an engineering perspective would take, I mean, you would run into so many, as they probably have in the past, run into so many issues. There's so many things to get right, and then so many things that can go wrong, right? To your point on this, where in an art context, you really can ask the questions and showcase certain idioms that really get people's attention, right?
Yeah, it's also the kind of the sort of the way that Elb fails is kind of its success, I think, or it's kind of the point. And I didn't like make it broken on purpose. It's a very real Lisp interpreter that in principle should be usable, right? But for a variety of reasons that really only became obvious through building it and like watching it fall down, that actually can't scale.
Can you talk a little bit about that, like in some details, or at least like maybe an example of some of those?
Yeah, no, for sure. So I get into this in detail in my 2019 deconstruct talk. So if this is interesting to anyone listening, you should look up that talk, and I pick these ideas apart in depth there. But the sort of the summary of it is so the problem. I actually went into Elb thinking that the main problem would be character encodings. The fact that everything is ASCII and should be Unicode, and that's part of the problem, but that's like actually not really the crux of it. The crux of it is that like programming is all about manipulating names, and there's no such thing as a culturally neutral name. Like you can't come up with a single name for something that does not carry the sort of cultural and linguistic assumptions of the person assigning the name. So when you use a library, or an API or an SDK or any body of code that someone else wrote, you actually have to use the exact names that they chose for all of their functions, all their constants, all of their classes, etc. So you're kind of forced into a linguistic collaboration with all these programmers that came before you and that you've never met. And even if like Elb was, I mean, Elb does function, but like in order for Elb to use the DOM API, right, because it runs in the browser, that's all English words, and you really use other words to invoke query selector all, like that. You just have to use that sequence of characters actually to invoke that native function, because that's what the spec says, right? So you're kind of stuck there. Like you can make a programming language with new keywords and with a Unicode instead of ASCII, but if you want to consume any software written in the last 50 years, you need to be able to engage with English language names, which means that a programming experience that is entirely not English is effectively impossible down that path. Short of a translation layer or something that basically forces you into being like a second-class citizen. So that's the sort of like summary of like the real wall that I hit, at least, and has sort of informed the next chapter of this research, which I could also talk about.
Oh, cool. Yeah, we'll get back to that. That's great. And and to your point, like, yeah, you have to engage with everything built before, which has been kind of stuck in it has been just done in a certain way, right? So that's right. Yeah. Obviously, that's a major problem. Working with pre-existing stuff, to your point, I think is super difficult. And maybe you can talk a little bit about this. And I know, once we get Jon's voice on talking about the historical ramification of this, can you talk a little bit about, I mean, you mentioned previous language attempts before. Is the issue that, because now obviously, particularly with the web, as we mentioned, like it's hard to now work with third-party stuff or things that you're just dependent on, like browsers that have canonicalized toward English. Did things go wrong somewhere? Could things have been done differently earlier, where we thought about language much earlier? This is kind of a hypothetical, but like, do you think that because we didn't start from the beginning, it makes it too difficult?
That's a good question. That's something that I've thought about. Is is there somewhere we could have zigged, or we should have zigged when we instead zagged? I honestly don't know. I have a sense of what basically the next chapter of this research is designing a programming language and a programming system that doesn't privilege one writing or like one language over any others. And I also get into a sketch of that in my deconstruct talk. But I mean, to do that, to the best of my understanding of how you would pull that off, you'd need access to technology that just did not exist in the 60s and the 70s when these foundations were being laid. Like the fact that the C programming language requires ASCII identifiers, of course it does. Like it was the early 70s. It was Unix. The web didn't exist. Like none of this stuff existed. I really think it's just a bunch of engineers doing the best that they could with the resources that they had. And the problem is, though, that, weirdly, despite not having any moving physical parts, or maybe it's because it has no moving physical parts, computing it, software just has an enormous inertia. I've done like an example that I use is like I've worked on motorcycles. I've worked on old motorcycles and more recent motorcycles. And like one, the CB series in the Honda has a series called the CBs, and I've worked on old ones and new ones. And every year they just make completely new vehicles, right? They learn from the old stuff, and they just start from scratch basically every year. Like maybe they reuse parts if they're useful, but they don't have to. We can't really do that in software. Like I'm talking to you on Linux, which is a Unix system and still has a bunch of like POSIX tools, like many of which are older than I am. And it's not just like the ideas that are living on; it's like the actual original software artifacts are all still like living and breathing. And that's all of modern computing, right? So I don't think that there's any obvious way that the engineers laying the foundations for modern computing in the 60s and 70s could have made it, non-hegemonic. But we are sort of stuck with the limitations basically of the 70s in the present, which is frustrating.
Yeah. Though I know we didn't take all the good parts from the 70s maybe, but yeah. Right. Okay, I think, Jon, do you hear us? Can you speak now?
I think I can. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Dope.
Hey.
Yeah. Dope. Thanks for joining, Jon.
I had to switch my Discord from my laptop to my phone, and then of course I don't know where any of the controls are on my phone. So I apologize.
I know you're here. It's good. Kind of on the vibe of linguistic collaboration, which I think is a great term that Ramsey brought up. Do you want to? Obviously, you've been working in linguistic collaboration for a while. Can you give us a little bit of intro yourself and the work you've been doing with the Cree language, and we'll link your Causal Islands talk as well. But yeah, give us a little history of your work in linguistic collaboration and writing esoteric programming languages.
Sure. Yeah. I guess, well, my work started about 7 to 8 years ago, and I came across Ramsey's work, fairly early on in my own research. What I wanted to do was create a programming language for Cree, because that's my ancestral language, and we have our own syllabary, so we have a syllabic system of writing that is kind of unique. My biggest challenge was, when I first started to kind of bring that language back into my family, through self-oppression. My grandmother didn't speak it and said that we were from France, and that was the language that she would speak to my grandfather. And it wasn't French, it was Cree. And So I want to bring that back into the family. And so I started learning Cree, and I was so eager that very first day I go to class, and I asked the elder, because they asked us as students, what words do you want to know? What is current to your context, and what words can we provide? And I put my hand up. I'm like, what's the word for computer? We'll make it easy, right? We'll just start from there. Cree doesn't have a word for computer, and it was that at that point, I realized that if you don't have a word for computer, how do you have words for things like network and protocols and exchange files, file names, servers, all of this technology jargon that we have. Cree doesn't have. Cree doesn't have those. So. One of the things that I set out to do, I found that I couldn't do it. And that was the biggest challenge, right? Was how do you communicate with a computer when there is no language that even that acknowledges what that computer is, right, within the language? And that was a huge challenge. I had to change my overall understanding of what a computer was in order to put it in the language, let alone come up with commands. And so programming in Cree wasn't a simple substitution of find the word for if or for next, and these programmatic concepts that I had to find new ways of articulating those experiences within the computer to get it to function the way I wanted it to do. And it involved a lot of cultural interaction. And it kind of, to Ramsey's point, you can't undo or remove the cultures that built the languages and the computers and the systems and the technologies. But what I ended up doing was my programming language is it's transcribed. I convert it. So I wrote it so that you can write in Cree, and then I convert that to C# code, and then that C# code actually executes. It's all written in English. Right. But the Cree language part of it was kind of the key part, because that was where we don't have. I asked questions of my elders, like, if it is nighttime, then I see the moon, or if it is daytime, then I see the sun, hoping to get back a translation that that reflected that if then kind of causality. And it doesn't. It says it is night. I see the moon at night is the response, right? So when it's converted or translated into Cree, and then I literally translate it back, the language that I'm getting back is a statement. There is no if and there is no then. That made a problem, right, when I was trying to work with conditional statements. So ultimately I ended up going a different route, and I followed some Malelo programming group from Hawaii. They were translating C# into Hawaiian. They have the same problem that if A equals B, then C logic doesn't exist in Hawaiian. The syntax doesn't translate. So they use the term for river, and so you flow down a river, and then at a junction you take path A or path B within the logic of their programming language. And water being important to Cree culture as well, as it is to a lot of indigenous cultures, I think, around the world, not just in North America. I like that. And so rivers became my if statement. And then by extension, I said, well, this is the way I should be looking at programming, is taking the cultural relevance of what those functions are, what they represent, and finding something that's culturally significant that has meaning and can be represented in that way. And so my looping structures became winters, because that's how we dictate age. It's also a great metaphor for advancing. So when you think of a next loop, a for loop that does, for x equals 1 to 10, that loop is advancing every iteration. Just like we age year to year, and so we advance in age. And so I really like that metaphor. And then I also took the idea of the variable just being a container that holds information, holds data. That is, I use different variable buckets, I call them, but there's a bucket or a bag, medicine bag. Lately, I've been using canoe because it fits the metaphor of the river better. So for every winter, I travel down the river in my canoe that has the number 5 in it. And I do a validity check on that 5 at some point, and I take a smaller river on one way or another way, right? So in this way, culture becomes the center point of the language, and the programming itself is a lot more aligned with storytelling than it is with programming. And that's ultimately, I think, what programming is for me, and always has been, a way of storytelling. It's just its syntax and its format that's different. So
yeah, no, that's really amazing, and kind of what I wanted to get at too, and then we'll maybe open it up for some other questions. But this is both for you and Ramsey, I think, and what it seems like is obviously the languages that you worked on themselves, obviously Cree and Arabic, they taught you something else about syntax and language that you were presenting in, and obviously, think. Yeah, as you mentioned, both of you came from a place of knowing, regular conventional programming and trying to decipher this kind of new way. What did the languages themselves teach you? I think I remember in Ramsey, you talk about in one of the videos, like obviously the length of the sound. And I know in Jon, in your talk, you also use size, like the terms for different sizes of things, right? It becomes really important to how you think about programming in the context of Cree and Arabic and what you've created. How much did you learn about implementations going from the language back to kind of creating these programming languages and systems that you came to?
I'll start first. One of the great things about the Cree language is it's morphemic, and so our language construction involves attaching prefixes and suffixes to either a noun or a verb to alter the meaning of that noun or verb, right? And so my example that I usually use is the atim. Atim is the word for dog. A mistatim, mista being a prefix, is used to enlarge it or make it big, so it becomes a big dog. In context, it usually means horse, though, in Cree. And going the other direction, atymosis, so using atim and then adding osis as a suffix it's a diminutive. It makes it smaller. And I thought that was a really interesting way to look at making things bigger and smaller. So if you wanted to increase the size of an array, and your array was called atim, you can say mistatim, increase the size of my array, right? Or atymosis, decrease the size of my array. And I can do that with integer values or what have you. It involves, it does present some, I'll say, illegal syntax in Cree language, because I could literally go mistatim and add a whole bunch, increasing the value, considerably by just adding a whole bunch of suffixes. What it does internally within the programming language, though, is it doesn't treat those individual tokens as individual tokens. It involves taking a token and being able to manipulate the token to alter its meaning and its function. So you can actually take you can take an integer and convert it to a string, or make it larger, make it smaller. You can change what it is, what it does, what it's called, even, because the syntax of the language allows you to do that. You can also change the order. So there's no, it's called free word order, where the syntax doesn't have to follow, like for x equals 1 to 10 has to follow that. You can't say x equals 1 to 10 for next, right? You can't rearrange those tokens in that sequence. But in Cree, you can. So long as all of the information is available on the single line, it doesn't matter what order it appears in. Usually, there's usually some organization that happens, but usually you can alter those two elements, and it doesn't change the meaning of the sentence, and it's still valid within the language. It was those types of ideas, bringing those into programming, kind of opened up a whole new way of programming for me in particular, because now I'm not thinking of things in these logical, recipe style, line by line, token by token type formations. It's a little bit more malleable than that. And that's the major takeaway that I got from working with my language and programming.
Cool. Very cool. Ramsey?
It was... I sort of went out of my way to make Elb as boring as possible and as much of a straightforward like Lisp implementation as I could, because again I was really interested in like looking for the cracks in the system. So despite being extremely conservative and boring, Elb uncovers all kinds of like assumptions about text editors, and like you said in the chat, even the URLs for like Elb, because like ALB is not the name of the project, right? Like Qaf Lam Ba, like the only correct name for the project is in Arabic, and I think the GitHub URL is just hyphen hyphen hyphen, like just by showing up and like being boring but in Arabic, everything starts falling apart, and that was its goal. So I didn't do nearly as much translation work as Jon did. And actually, Jon, it was Cree Sharp that really kind of contextualized to me how, despite feeling very, foreign and not Western, and Arab culture is not really a Western culture, it has a closeness to the culture that produced computing that Cree, like, indigenous North American cultures do not. And it kind of like, I don't know, I was reminded of that because we have a word for computer, right? We have a word for network. We have words for all that stuff. Again, because we are on this side of the Atlantic, and there's a closeness to Europe and to those Western cultures. But the one, again, when I was building out, I was much more interested in like text and text encoding. So the one interesting thing that it does, which to my understanding is novel in programming language theory, is the you can stretch out words in Elb, and it's all semantically valid. So the way that works is, so Arabic is a cursive language, and when you write it by hand, the distance between the letters that are joined is not semantic. You can make it as much or as little as you want, and that's often used to great artistic effect. And if anyone wants to drool over maps, look up Ottoman cartography. They do like some of the most beautiful maps in the Arabic script I think that I've ever seen, and they will like actually stretch out the label of a river to sort of follow the river that it's labeling, and it just reads perfectly like a single word if you're an Arabic reader. So in Unicode, there's a character, or there's a code point called the tatwil, which looks like an underscore, but it's actually designed to, you can stick it in between Arabic letters, and they'll render as if they were stretched out. So the Elb parser actually looks out for that character, and it doesn't treat it as white space, because you can't have white space in the middle of your identifiers and you blow up your identifiers. It kind of ignores it for the purposes of identifier parsing, if that makes sense. So you can stretch out letters as long as you want, which means that you can do a certain kind of a justification, where instead of being left aligned or right aligned, you can do a tatwil aligned, where everything is just left and right aligned, and you've actually stretched out the words to fill the spaces, and it just looks gorgeous, especially in monospace. And it's like maybe my favorite like visual flourish of the whole project is the fact that you can stretch out the letters.
You're almost writing like inference rules right in the code or something like this, right? Like that can be aligned very nicely, right? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Just and to Becky's earlier point about like language and culture, I mean, something that I was interested in is, I mean, like Arabs have a long history of kind of an adoration of text, but so do programmers. Like programmers like have a culture of text, and we have deep opinions about how to write text and how to present text, and we jokingly call them holy wars, quote unquote. So draw whatever conclusions you want from that. But merging these two cultures, both of which have a history of like a textual mindfulness, was a big part of like of Elb, certainly the aesthetics.
That's really awesome note. those are good things. But before we kind of move on to some other questions, Brooke, did you want to bring up something, and also maybe we'll open up anybody in the audience who wants to maybe kind of ask something.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not super great at jumping in while people are having back and forth banter. Maybe to take the conversation in a similar but like slightly different direction. We spent a bunch of time talking about high-level syntax, which is totally useful, super interesting. And it's amazing how like immediately brittle, you were saying, even just changing the text encoding just breaks all of the editors and all of this stuff. Something I've always found really interesting about language is how it changes the way that you think and the way you approach problems. And really, if you look at computing, it's not just a product of the 70s. It's actually a product of the 19th century sort of, Western European, project. And even in a Western tradition, as a North American, English speaker, trying to, take sort of newer ways of thinking about things, so, postmodernism, et cetera, and applying them into computing, both culturally, it's almost like, heretical to say, well, not everything you write has objective truth. And, it's still trying to pull back to, effectively Turing machines and, all of these, very sort of, objectivist ideas, or even that there can be, I found it very interesting, John, you were saying, having idea of, if-else branches. And branchless programming is totally a thing, right? But you'd only really get into it if you start to dig really deep into sort of, far reaches of certain corners of design. And it can often be more efficient, but we haven't been trained that way to think this way by our culture. So I actually wonder, and this is a question for both of you, what are the ways in which, Cree or Arabic or other languages change the way that you think about things, and what would it, when you're writing in your languages, different approaches that you would take to problems? Like, does it change the way that you approach engineering problems as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have a lot of, I'll tackle that last kind of comment first with engineering. One of the things I wanted to tackle was our use of the QWERTY keyboard. So in coding with Cree and putting the syllabics into the system, I didn't want to just map the code. Our language, the word for syllabic in Cree translates as a spirit marker, right? And so there's at the level of written text, it is still spirit, right? It comes from the spirit world, and so to use this Western contraption of a QWERTY keyboard to type it in just seems kind of sacrilegious. And so I wanted to, I created my own keyboard specifically for the Cree syllabary, as it's arranged. Usually we have pedagogical tools, and one of them is called the Cree star chart. So the syllabics are arranged kind of in this star formation. And so I created a keyboard that mimics that star formation and is very intimately tied to culture and cultural teachings. There's a ton of embedded metaphor within that engineering of that particular device, right? Now, when it comes to the actual system, a lot of those things translate into things that happen in the computer as well. And I usually talk about my smudge function, for example. I just noticed that when you are writing a program, I remember my earliest days writing Apple Basic, in the 1980s. I was 10 or 11. And we always started off with CLS, right? Clear screen. But there's a lot more to it than that. When you run a program, you want to, I don't want any residual, cached files or anything like that. I want to clear the screen. I want to make sure that my speakers are reset and just prepare the system to run the program, right? So you're trying to free it of anything thing that might obstruct that program from running. But that we do those as ceremony within community, and we have a practice called a smudge, and that's exactly what it does. It's meant to clear your eyes, clear your voice, clear your heart, clear your mind, prepare you for the learning process that's going to happen, right? So the very first call in any one of my programming languages is always a smudge, albeit it's in a digital format, but it carries that same concept, and it does a digital formation of what we do in real life, translates it to a digital function that the computer also has to do within its own context. And so when I think about these things that I'm translating from Cree culture into computing, it's not just finding fancy things that kind of equate to similarities. They're mirrored versions, just in a digital format. And I also use binaries. So we have a natural binary. Our language uses animacy. So words are animate or inanimate depending on what they're describing. And so I don't speak of binary in the binary context of Cree is animacy. It's animate or inanimate. And I really like that because a 0 in binary code is inanimate. Doesn't do anything, doesn't go anywhere. Whereas a 1 is your animate. It's open, it's open-ended, and it can continue whatever direction it goes, right? So just those simple concepts. And I jokingly say that computing and computer programming in particular is inherently indigenous. Like the indigenous knowledges that I am finding within practices. And a lot of those are just developed, and some of them are developed in Western contexts, or many of them are can just naturally be viewed in an indigenous context without changing them, and they're very valuable in that sense.
Yeah, that's I've always looked to your work, John, for that. The sort of deep. I don't want to say translational, but the sort of like semantic is maybe what I'm looking for. The sort of meditation on those semantic differences. There isn't as much of it in El, again, because I think there are more straightforward translations for most constructs. There are more interesting ones that I sort of deliberately avoided to keep it as conservative as possible. Because it's slightly different goals. But the one wrinkle that I ran into was actually translating true and false. So Elb is a Lisp, and you have a bunch of atoms, and you need to support the notion of true and false. And I ended up going with sah and khata, which are really like right and wrong. Just the connotation just isn't right, and there are other words, but they start to connote like honesty and lying, which is also not the vibe, right? So just the simple concept of this is a true statement. To your point, Brooklyn, of sort of a very 19th century, very European, there's truth, and then there's falsehood, and through the sort of mechanisms of man, we can split the world into those two categories. Even that I kind of struggled to translate. So I did end up going with sah and khata for right and wrong. But that still doesn't hit my ear the right way. It doesn't feel right. But I don't quite know what else. I think you would maybe approach the whole thing differently, right? If you were doing it from a semantically from Arabic from scratch. Which is a perspective I don't actually have access to, right? I've been bilingual my whole life. When I studied math and computer science, the language of instruction was in English, despite it being in Beirut. So I have uncles who studied math in Arabic, and they have that aunts and uncles and relatives who are much more in touch with a completely non-Western sort of view of the world. But that starts to get into the limitations of my own perceptions, honestly.
That's humorous, actually, because you bring up. I completely forgot. I also have that problem in Cree with true false. So I use a word called tepwe, which means in truth, or true. It's just an agreement. I couldn't find a suitable opposite to that. There is no false. The closest I got was actually it's nasbach, which means contrary or opposite. And so there's truth, and then there's the opposite, right? There is a word for untruth, which is also kind of opposite, but it doesn't carry that same thing. And so I also struggled with that truth and false, and still do, much like your example. That's interesting.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, you'd think those things would be, you just knock them out real easy, but like those are the stumbling blocks. I also, not in a programming context, I had, I'm old enough to have had a Nokia flip phone 1,000 years ago, and I would sort of switch it between English and Arabic, and Nokia had decent Arabic localizations, and I was writing a long text message, and I got an error when I tried to send it, and I recognized the error from the English UI, and in the English UI, the error would have said, the message you're sending is too long. But the Arabic pop-up would have translated to, the message you're sending is very long. And I paused for a second. I'm like, no, I know. I've been writing it for a long time. And then when I thought about it, there actually isn't a way to say that X is to Y in Arabic. We just don't have that construct. You could say bigger than expected. You could say bigger than allowed. But you have to sort of compare it to something else. So there are definitely these like semantic, like totally unobvious gaps. That because Elb is a Lisp, I dodged most of them. Aside from true and false, I think was the big one. But I think a language that's like more built out, I think you start to run into them more and more.
Yeah, those are super great points. Those are great.
I just want to add one more thing. Yeah, because when you mentioned mathematics, I also have a problem with that. Cree in our language, we have language for numbers, obviously. The challenging number though is the number is our word for 9, which is gega mitatat. Mitatat is the number for 10, is the word for 10. Gega mitatat literally translates as almost 10. We don't have a word for 9. We use a filler, and that's just because cosmologically speaking, 9 is not a significant number within our context, and so within Cree Sharp, you can't type 9. 9 has to either be 10 minus 1 or 8 plus 1 to get 9, because I've removed the word from that language, right? So it was a wrench. I believe, culturally speaking, it was brought in as a matter of trade, right? So when fur trade and settlers started coming, we needed 9 in order to do proper accounting and bookkeeping. But within the culture, within the community, 9 is not necessary. Using almost 10 will fits the bill, but 8 is also almost 10, and 8.5 is almost 10. 9.5 is almost 10. So I when you mentioned mathematics, that's what made me think of that.
That's amazing. It makes me think of just one thing I'll say, just so we don't stay on this point for too long. But that's fascinating to hear. We have a very different notion of time and the passage of time certainly in the Levant, I think in the Mediterranean in general. I've heard it described as like, polychronic versus monochronic time. But the sense of like, if there's an event at 8, do you show up at 8? And in Lebanon, you don't, right? It's actually kind of rude to do that. You show up at 8:30, right? Or at 9. And this is like a fluency that I had to learn in America because I'm just late to everything and people get mad at me and I didn't understand why. But this isn't classical Arabic, but in Lebanese Arabic, we use the same word to mean tomorrow as we do for the word for eventually. So we say bukra might mean literally tomorrow, or it might mean at some point in the future, right? And the sort of like there's maybe a fetishization of precision that I feel like non-Western European cultures don't necessarily have. and the sense of like we've actually built enough constructs, like that's precise enough for our cultural needs, right? And sort of feeding that into a computer, I think then becomes a challenge. But not having a way to say like 9 is that's amazing, John. I'm gonna hang on to that one.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that's great. Becky had a question from the audience. But Becky, do you wanna ask your question?
Hello. Yes. Thank you both so much. This is so fascinating. My question is, so I'm a language nerd, and I've been studying ancient Egyptian as well since like the pandemic started. And my question is, how would you approach a language that is like pictorial, that's like hieroglyphs, right? When programming or making a programming language, with ancient Egyptian, it's so interesting because there's this interplay with the art as well as the words. Like if you're looking at a tomb painting, they interact with each other in a way that, like, if a person is making an offering, like a pharaoh is making an offering to a god, the words are written in the direction of that action, because you can write left to right, right to left, or top to bottom. And then the person or the god that's receiving that offering is bestowing blessings on the pharaoh. And so the words explaining this are going from now right to left, right? Or like the opposite direction, towards where that action is going. So it just makes me think, like, we don't really have a way to go. I guess with Elb, you're able to go right to left, and you can go left to right, but can you go top to bottom? And how does all that work? So these are just questions that are popping up in my head. I wonder if y'all have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on orthography. Elb it's not that you can go from right to left. You have to go right to left. Arabic is not legible unless it's written right to left. The interplay between like writing and art is central to Arabic as a language. We don't have a word for calligraphy because it's so central to writing. The closest, the word that is used is khat, which just means line. So the act of making marks on a page, the act of making lines on a page is calligraphy, right? There isn't really a distinction. The kind of handwriting that you just do casually in your notebook and the stuff you'd see on like mosques and palaces, they're sort of different gradations of the same category of thing. They're not different sort of things as far as Arabic is concerned. And none of that survives in the translation to computers, unfortunately. Typing Arabic on a keyboard is absolutely miserable. It's like, watching a movie that was shot on IMAX, on a cell phone held at like arm's length, right? It's just like not, it's so far from the intended experience of a language. On my Android device, I actually have the modern Android systems have really good handwriting recognition for Arabic. And that's the only thing that I use to input Arabic, and it is an absolute joy because the writing system, as it exists on computers, you have a sequence of letters that are sort of plopped down next to each other, and they're sort of joined. And that's 10% of like what Arabic as a written language is. It's full of flourishes and tricks and playfulness and like all kinds of ways you can tuck letters in and out of each other and like put words on top of each other sometimes. It's technically a two-dimensional language because some of the letters don't all stack horizontally. Some of them are technically supposed to stack vertically. But all of this just gets basically ignored for the interest of making something that is passably legible on a computer. And that, to me, is the big heartbreak, right? Because we just kind of gave up. And Arabic on computers is legible, but it's not playful. It's not beautiful. We can't actually do what Ottoman cartography did on modern web mapping. Like that's just inexpressible, given how like text has to be rendered on a modern web map. So for other languages that are, that deeply intertwined, the like artistry and writing, I would worry that like computers, as much as we like to think of them as these like all-powerful modern machines, they're actually quite limited. And the limitations really start to show, I think, when you get into cultures that have different relationships with their text. So that was my experience with that with Arabic.
I have like Ramsey, I have a lot of comments and ideas around language construction. I don't know how much of the project I'm working on a project right now with Daniel Temkin that is a conlang, so it's a constructed language that's also a programming language. And some of these ideas of being able where directionality is a thing within writing, and the orthography and how it can be represented within a space, and what those directions mean and how they can change what the instructions actually are things that we're thinking through. And it's there is an indigenous hieroglyphic language, I want to say 16th century, that used pictographs, so similar to rock paintings or rock markings, and those they're not necessarily left to right or right to left, although they usually are arranged in relationship to direction. So north, south, east, and west, and east in Cree is the direction of the sun. It's the direction of knowledge, and so we arrange a lot of things to the eastern direction. But in other indigenous cultures in North America, we have other arrangements where arranging something north to south is important for a given reason within that context. And so, as you're mentioning about the hieroglyphics being, the direction was specific to the participants and the activity that was being undertaken. Those things do happen in North American like First Nations and Indigenous communities where that direction is important, and so finding a way to represent that within the computer is something that I'm kind of actively looking at. I don't know what that's actually going to look like, but those are certainly things that I don't know how many other people out there were interested in tackling some of those. I know some other languages. Piat comes to mind because it's directional. And for creating graphics, the program itself is a graphic, but it also is directional, so you can create a pathing through the program. So it goes up and down or left and right based on the instructions that are within the program. And then, so those ideas, right? So if you're just looking at a hieroglyph as a marker, as a symbol for something, and within that symbol, there are other symbols that tell you directionality and meaning or context. Those are interesting within a programming context because they can open up new ways of writing code, and understanding what that code actually represents, categorizing it also within the code is there's a lot there. That's a whole nother podcast, I'm sure.
There's a live coding music programming language called Orca that is also two-dimensional in the way that you're describing, John, where it's ASCII, but every command is a single character, and you're basically inputting them into a grid of characters, and they affect each other in a two-dimensional way. Like certain characters will actually create other characters that'll travel horizontally or vertically and trigger different like notes on synthesizers and stuff. But that's the closest sort of practical system that comes to mind.
Cool. Yeah, I'm going to make a note of that one.
Yeah, it's very cool.
Thanks.
Yeah, Orca is very, very cool. I've seen that as well. Yeah, one thing I wanted to kind of say to all this is I think it just showcases the importance to the semantics of programming. I mean, obviously in logic and like programming language theory, there's so much in the study of like how do you equate programs or logics, right? That could look completely different. I mean, there's a great somebody reminded me recently of a talk by Guy Steele, where he goes through the history of like in papers, in programming language papers, and like particularly looking at like rules and the syntax of rules, typically in Greek letters. All the differences where like papers talk about the same program structures, but do so completely differently syntactically, and yet try to convey the same meaning. It's a great kind of historical view he gave. I think was at the like keynote, like one of the closure conferences one year, and it just showcases like how varied this stuff is. I mean, I think you all mentioned, or Ramsey, I think you mentioned time. In languages, we don't even have a lot of great concepts in like conventional programming for working with time as a first class citizen, right? You and I have talked about Chuck, numerous times in the past, right? Another audio oriented language. And so I think, like all these concepts of semantics, like, where, classical logic has negation, but propositional logic does not. Like all these kind of things are just really interesting how we, even in conventional logics that we've had. And then now when you add so many more layers from culture, it's even more complicated. Like how could you equate programs across languages and logics at the same time, right? That would be like maybe a forever PhD. But those are kind of interesting things that come out as well, right? Because we even now there's papers in conventional languages trying to like equate the sugared syntax, Python list versus for comprehension. That was a really cool paper from a few years ago looking at the semantic meaning of sugar. And again, now how do we apply that for languages that like that Jon is working in, that you're working in, Ramsey, right? These are that, like between sugar and that, and then another language, another translation of the semantic layer. That just seems like, I mean, it seems fascinating, but it also seems like, very, very hard.
Yeah. And how do you do that? I mean, my instinct as a computer scientist is like, well, everything compiles down to something, and then we make the comparison at a lower level. But if that lower level, that lower level is going to have some semantic bias, right? It's going to, afford certain things and not afford other things. And like, what is that lower level? And like, how do you construct one that doesn't close the doors on potentially like other cultures and their way of thinking about time and truthfulness and and falsehood and all that. That sounds like multiple PhDs above my pay grade.
Yeah, I think what you kind of hit at there is that there is already a syntactic bias. You try to get rid of all that, go to some semantic core layer, but the problem is semantic bias that incorporates culture, incorporates all those other things, right? And I think that's it's like it's truly the onion of things. I want to open it up for the audience to any other questions. I don't want to go too much longer, but we've had a great stuff so far. But I'm guessing people in the audience might have something. We've had a really lively chat as well.
One other question I had was with the word inshallah in Arabic, and this idea of like something that you're planning for the future, but it's literally translated to like God willing, right? So is that something that can be expressed in a programming language? This might go back to the conversation of if-then statements and how tricky those are. But I wonder if you could talk, Ramsey, about that.
Yeah. So it's actually 3 words. It's in.
I think so.
Yeah. It's in, which in this context means if. Sha, which is an old word meaning to desire, and then Allah, which is God. So inshallah, if God wills. And it's but the connotation is it's one of like hopefulness and an uncertainty about the future, right? You'll say inshallah for everything in Arabic. Like like I was talking to my folks yesterday, and we're like, all right, we'll talk again this weekend, and you'll say inshallah. Right. So it's like who knows what could happen between now and then. It's like an acknowledgement that the future is kind of uncertain. Which also tracks with like a lot of distributed system stuff where you make a request and like, are you gonna get a response? Inshallah. I don't know. I hope so. Is it gonna time out? Inshallah not. I hope not. Arab does not play with that. Arab uses the word idha for if, which is more generally means if instead of the in that's in inshallah. I did a museum installation though. I wrote the back end for it, and at the start of every show, the console it just prints out, "Let's have a good show, inshallah." Just because, all kinds of things could go wrong, and I just want to kind of express a sort of uncertainty about or almost like a humility in the face of like things that could go wrong. That's the one time I've snuck an inshallah into my work. So there's a museum in Philadelphia where in the basement there's a server just printing out inshallah a couple times a day. But it is a much bigger thing to unpack, and I'm happy to do it if it's interesting. But there is also a difference between Arab culture and Islamic culture. There's a big overlap between the two. And I am a Muslim, but it was important to me that Elb really be about Arabic and Arab culture and not specifically Islamic culture. So something that you would also do that I also almost did for Elb, sort of in line with inshallah. There's another similarly Islamic phrase, which is Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which is in the name of God, the benevolent and merciful. And many religious Muslims will put that phrase at the top of every legal document. They'll say it when they enter a room. It's basically it's sort of it's like the opening thing you do when you're about to begin an activity. It's so common that it's actually encoded in Unicode as a single code point. So you don't even have to type the whole phrase out. There's one glyph, basically, that is a calligraphic representation of that whole phrase. I thought of making Elb programs begin with that, which would be totally idiomatic. But again, that starts to get into this is Arab Muslim culture and not just Arab culture, which includes Arab Christians and Arab Jews and Arab atheists and agnostics like myself. So that's a sort of a fine line to walk, but yeah, Elb is an Arabic and not an Islamic project, deliberately.
I'll just add one quick thing. Go for it. Just quickly, in Cree culture, we don't have a word for goodbye. So because there is no end, right? We go through life in stages, and afterlife is a stage, and so there's no beginning and there's no end to time. So again, we also have a different view of what time is. And so we don't have a word for goodbye because there's never a goodbye. We always say something like later, see you then, see you, or that's all for now, is another common one. So yeah, we have very, very similar ideas about not terminating conversation, so to speak. It's just sometimes preserved for another point in the future.
So all programs should run forever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
we solved the halting problem.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's a semantic view. Yeah, it's amazing. Not to go too long here, one thing I want to kind of end on, and we talked a little bit about the future of these work that both of you all are working on. Maybe each of you can talk a little bit about where you're taking the work, and then obviously we'll have all the links and stuff, and people can kind of go further, but like where they can keep up with you. But like where are things going, respectively?
I'll go first. So I'm just nearing the end of my dissertation that kind of outlines, everything I've kind of worked on for the past. I'm getting close to 6.5 years now, and where it's going to go from here is actually defining a little bit more concrete what an indigenous computing theory is. That's ultimately what I've ended up focusing on. So what does that mean? What does it entail? And can it be used as a template for other indigenous groups? We don't all have the same cultural belief systems and languages and whatnot, but there's a fairly significant portion of our daily practices and our belief systems and cosmologies that intersect. So it's possible that a pan-indigenous computing theory can be a thing, and that's where my work is heading. is not just sitting at the programming level anymore, but reconceptualizing computing in just general terms, and putting it into contexts that are more accessible to Indigenous people using their real world experiences from within their culture, and how they interact with the world is at times considerably different than how we do it in a Western context. So that's where my work's heading.
Yeah, so I'm where I got to with ELB was the conclusion that making a programming language or adding one programming language to the pantheon of programming languages was that was sort of never the goal, and ELB sort of gave me the language to sort of really identify why that shouldn't be the goal and can't be the goal. So the sort of next a phase of that project is designing a programming language that is not anchored in any written culture. That an English-speaking programmer and a French-speaking programmer and an Arabic-speaking programmer and a Tamil, even potentially a Cree, and everyone can sort of program in their own languages and have the system work and be able to collaborate. So I can pull in French libraries and Cree libraries into my Arabic program, and maybe wrap that up into a library that I export that is then used by English-speaking programmers. So I have designs for that. It's actually, I also get into it in my my deconstruct talk, and the reason that stalled is that right after that talk, COVID happened. So the world ended, which sort of slowed me down somewhat. But that's still. That the basic design that I described there still feels sound to me, and there are other non-culturally cited tools that work in a similar way. There's a programming language called Unison that is really, really interesting, and you get really interesting distributed systems properties when you stop anchoring your programming in a particular language, and code just becomes these hash values that sort of float around, and everything compiles down to WebAssembly. So that's the next chapter, is a sort of language agnostic language, which doesn't really have a name and sort of by definition can't have a name. But that's still sort of active research for me.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. Yeah. A lot of thoughts there. Yeah, it's amazing. And cool. And thank you both. I don't want to make it go over long here. I mean, there's also a whole part in Jon's Causal Islands talk where we talk about the open sourcing of the language and the issues there within. It's super deep. I tell people to go watch that part of the talk as well. And how we share these things is also super important and more complicated than you would think. But yeah, I want to thank you both, Jon and Ramsey, for just amazing work, and then making everyone aware of all this work, which is equally as important. And I just a big thank you for that, and for coming on here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having me too.